With a historic crop of wide receiver talent hitting the NFL, I looked through 20 years of fantasy data to find out what we should expect. Stick around to find out how you should value this year's rookie wide receivers. Plus, I unveil my updated rookie wide receiver rankings, all on the Fantasy First Down. Welcome to the Fantasy First Down. I'm Ben Wasley. If you haven't already, make sure you like and subscribe on YouTube. You can also find us on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down, where I answer all of your DMs. I'm also on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. You can also find my rankings and all of my articles on ffdfantasyfootball.com. Now, today we're talking wide receivers, and it is a bumper wide receiver class. I'll be going through using the same methodology as my quarterback and running back heat rate videos. You can also find them here on the channel. Because we're talking wide receivers, we are naturally going to be categorizing things slightly differently, but we're still using the same 8 categories. The difference here is that wide receivers last longer in the year. So we're expecting our wide receivers to have been productive for a little bit longer. To be a superstar wide receiver, the player basically needs to have at least one top 5 finish, and they need to have been fantasy relevant for at least 7 years. That is to say, they need to have at least 7 years of top 60 fantasy finishes. The same applies for all the other categories. Studs need to have at least one top 10 finish and then be fantasy relevant for at least 5 years, and so on and so forth. You can see the explanation at the bottom of the screen. I've also got the guys in there who are brief boom or brief value players. That is to say, they didn't have the longevity, but they at least had some good fantasy finishes along the way. Anyone who wasn't good for at least 2 years and didn't have at least one top 10 finish, I consider them to be a bust. Obviously, that depends on your definition of bust, but that's how I've gone with it for the video, so we have an idea of what we should expect. Now, to be fair, up front, nobody ended up as a brief boom in the wide receivers. We see quite a few of these with the running backs and even with the quarterbacks, but for wide receivers, if you finished in the top 10, then you did hang around for an extended period of time. So having a good wide receiver finish does pretty much guarantee you an extended stay in the league. The closest exception to that was Hunter Renfrow, who had a top 11 finish and then managed to hang around the league for only 3 years of being really fantasy relevant. Though I guess his career isn't over yet, so he could potentially bounce back. Let's get into things. So we're going to start off with the true studs. These are the elite guys in this wide receiver class, and we have 3 of them. While Marvin Harrison Jr. and Malik Nabers are the guys getting most of the plaudits, Rome Odunze would be the top wide receiver most years. He is also that good. So we're talking about 3 guys who fall into this elite category. How are we expecting them to perform? Well, wide receivers who have been drafted in the top 10 in the last 20 seasons, 50% of them have at least one top 10 finish, and those guys have all hung around for at least 5 years. Plus, there's another group of them who've also managed to at least be good wide receivers over that time. I know a lot of the time when we talk about these wide receivers who were drafted early, we think of guys like John Ross, who are busts, but realistically, they're more of an exception than the rule. There's a lot more guys like your Jamar Chases, your Jalen Waddles, Devonta Smith, the guys in recent years who've turned out to be good producers in the NFL. I would expect that to continue here. We're not talking about guys who are flash in a pan or who only have specific talents. We're talking about guys with great all-round games who should manage to be a success in the NFL for the long term and have a really good chance of being superstars or studs in fantasy. 50% of the time, these guys are, and that's a lot better than guys picked in later rounds. There is a big drop-off between guys picked in the top 10, and even from there, guys picked between pick 11 and pick 24. So these are guys that you've got to be getting early in drafts. I know that Rome Odunze is falling a little bit because of the situation he goes into, but even players drafted in this area that go into awkward situations still turn out to be fantasy successes the majority of the time. So he's someone you can probably get a lot of value on, given a lot of people are letting him fall and going towards the guys like the quarterbacks, running backs like Jonathan Brooks or Brock Bowers. So Odunze still has that value. And realistically for me, he should be a top 5 pick in most rookie drafts. Where it gets a lot more interesting is in this next group here, which has just Brian Thomas Jr. in it. I've separated it at the 24 pick cutoff because that's where the data kind of drops off a little bit. Guys from pick 11 to pick 24 look a lot different from guys from pick 25 onwards. So I've taken 25 to 40 as a different group of picks. And you can see there is a drop off from those superstars in that top round. We're talking about still a good 50% of the guys being good, solid starters, but a lot less of them are going to be absolute superstars. I know we've got the big names like CeeDee Lamb and Justin Jefferson in this group, but you also have a lot more busts. You have your Traylon Burkses, you have your Jalen Ragers, you have your Kadarius Tonys. I think there is a chance that Brian Thomas Jr. falls into that group. He does have some issues that the top guys don't have. He has some drop issues. He's a little bit lazy with his route running. So while there's a lot of upside there, he's certainly more likely to fall into those lower categories than the top guys are. Having said that, the fact that he's been drafted this early does mean that teams are likely to at least give him a go. About 3/4 of the guys drafted in this area are at least going to be fantasy relevant for a while. And that means that you should draft Thomas with confidence, knowing that he went into this area. Having said that, that doesn't mean that you should necessarily rank him above the guys that come next. And you'll see at the end of the video how I rank these rookie wide receivers relative to each other. Now, the next group is where things get really interesting. We had this big run of wide receivers in the back half of the first round and the early part of the second round. And that happens in a lot of years. You do get a lot of players going in this area. And plenty of them have had a lot of success. We've got guys like Debo and Ayuk at the 49ers. Calvin Ridley's been really good. DeAndre Hopkins. We've seen Michael Pittman look pretty good at times. T. Higgins went in this area. So there have been a lot of players go in this range, but there have also been a lot more busts. Over half of the players going in this range haven't managed to be fantasy relevant for at least 4 years. And that's really interesting because that's very different from what we see even up to pick 24. So you're talking about a far higher bust likelihood in this range. And you've got to take that into account while looking at those players. You're still likely to get a fair few superstars out of this range. And with 5 players being drafted here, you'd have to think that at least one of these guys is going to be very good. Plus, there'll be plenty of solid starters as well. This is a very good wide receiver class, and we're seeing good players drop a little bit lower than we would usually because there's so many good wide receivers available. Having said that, you do have to understand that they're significantly more likely to bust in this range than in other range. You're going to get guys like your Rashad Batemans and your Philip Dorsetts and N'Keal Harris and things like that, who went in classes that had other talented wide receivers in it. They just weren't as good as the other guys in the class, and they didn't pan out. Plus, the landing spot makes a big difference as well. After that, we kind of have a bit of a fall off, and we only had Adonai Mitchell into this next area, and it is a far weaker area in the later part of the second round. You got far less top-end guys. While you still have A.J. Brown, Michael Thomas, Devontae Adams, guys who have very high fantasy seasons, you also have a lot of guys who really struggle. Guys like John Mechie, who hasn't turned out, Tyquan Thornton, a lot of guys who we just never really thought of particularly highly, and they never really worked out. That definitely happens in this range. Having said that, a lot of those guys were considered reaches at the time. That's not true of Adonai Mitchell. We know why he fell. He had character issues. He struggles to manage his diabetes. So there's a lot of reasons why he fell down the draft, but the talent's always been there. The bust is a possibility, but it's not going to be because of his talent. It's going to be because of whether he's willing to put the hard work in and do the right things to become a successful NFL player. While the numbers say 60% of the time he's not going to be particularly useful for fantasy for you, I think there is a reasonable chance that Mitchell works out, because of how good this class is and because of the fact that he fell because of character issues rather than talent issues, unlike a lot of the other guys in this region where we did think they were being taken a little bit early at the time. The third round is where it gets really ugly. And we do have a lot of names here that some people like, but you've got to be really careful in understanding that the majority of these guys will bust. We're talking about 70% of guys who aren't going to have anything more than 1 or 2 top 60 seasons. That's kind of the upside for most of these guys. And when you look at these names, you can kind of project the kind of guys that might struggle a little bit. You look at Luke McCaffrey and you look at Jalen McMillan and you think, they're barely true third round guys. They went towards the end of the third round. They're probably going to struggle a little bit. But you also look at some of the other guys like Roman Wilson, who goes into a fantastic situation, goes into a situation with the Steelers where a lot of the Steelers' day 2 wide receivers have had success. And you have to think, well, he could turn out. Same thing with Jermaine Burton, who definitely has first round talent, but naturally really struggled to actually manage his off the field stuff and his work ethic and his character issues. And that caused him to fall a little bit. For that reason, you've got to be really careful drafting these guys. You know that one of them will probably hit, but you don't know which one. And there are three viable options here. So you can take these guys, but you want to be taking them kind of very late second round of your rookie drafts, ideally third round or even fourth round, because that's where the value is going to be. I think these guys are probably going to fall because realistically, once people have already taken a wide receiver in their rookie draft, they're not going to ideally want to go for another one. So this is kind of that range where we're talking about the second wide receivers being taken in rookie drafts. That's going to mean that these guys will fall and you might get value in the later rounds. Now, we get into the day three guys, and this is where the value really drops off. A lot of these guys really struggle. We're talking about a very high bust percentage, and even the guys that hang around, most of them are just okay fantasy players. There are some superstars in here. Puka Nacua broke the mold last season. Amon-Ra St. Brown was very successful. Tyreek Hill obviously has had some success, and same thing with Stephon Diggs. So there's some big names coming in this range, but there's a lot of guys that you wouldn't want on your fantasy teams. Obviously, the fact that there's over twice as many players being drafted in this range, and I only had to go back to 2012 to get that, should tell you something. A lot of these guys, and it is a shallow draft class in general because of the way it worked with the COVID seasons and also with the ability to take that extra year. I think that and the transfer portal as well. I think that means that we have weaker class in general. A lot of these guys are not even going to be true fourth and fifth round guys. And for that reason, I think we're going to see a lot of special teamers out of this group. There's no one that I really love here, even though I've heard a lot of people talking about Troy Franklin and Javon Baker. Look at that success rate. We're talking about 4% of these guys turning into superstars, but really only 5% of them are even turning into starters. That's a top 24 fantasy season. You want a higher odds of that happening than what you're getting here. We're talking about a 1 in 20 chance of your guy being a top 24 fantasy player. How much are you paying to get these guys? How much are you giving up to get them? They're probably better options. Unless you're late in fantasy drafts and we're talking towards the fourth round, I can't imagine a situation where I'm going out of my way to get these players. They're just so unlikely to pay off for you. And there's so much better talent earlier in the draft. You want to be getting those earlier wide receivers. There's better options elsewhere later on in drafts. The running backs are going to fall. And while the running backs are not likely to work out, as you saw in my running back hit rate video, they're significantly more successful when they're drafted on day three. And that means you want to be taking your wide receivers early and then taking the running backs later on and at least having a chance at hitting somewhere. Where it gets really ugly is round 6, round 7. There are going to be guys that you think, oh, look, that name looks good. People like Brendan Rice, who's obviously got the name familiarity, is going early here. A lot of people like Johnny Wilson and Malik Washington. And what are the chances of them hitting? Well, pretty much zero. The odds of them hitting is very, very low. There've been exactly 100 players, which makes the percentages really easy to work out since 2014. How many of them have had success? Well, Russell Gage and Noah Brown. And they're not even guys that you particularly want on your fantasy rosters at any point in time. Brown was okay at times last season. Gage had 1 or 2 good seasons. We're not talking about particularly talented fantasy players. We're talking about a whole lot of busts. Now, people go, well, Antonio Brown, he was massive. That was in 2010. He's the only successful player since 2010 coming in the 6th and 7th rounds among wide receivers. You don't want these guys on your rosters. The chances of them succeeding is so low. The same thing goes with undrafted players, but even more so. Most teams are going to have 3 undrafted wide receivers on their roster from this year's wide receiver class. So we're talking 100 undrafted free agent wide receivers on rosters. How many of them have been successful? Well, you think of guys like Adam Thielen and you go, well, look, there's a chance. And there is a chance. We're talking less than a 1% chance. There are better free agents available in your fantasy leagues than a 1% chance. I promise you can do better. You do not want guys in this range. This is where you go for people like running backs who are going into situations where they just need an injury. There's no talent situation there. Running backs undrafted can be very good. Think about Austin Eckler. Think about Raheem Mostert. The same thing doesn't happen with wide receivers. It's very unusual to have successful wide receivers that are undrafted. The fact that Robbie Chosen or Robbie Anderson, when he was successful, is the second best name I could find among undrafted wide receivers should tell you something about how good these players are. You should not be interested in these guys at all. Now, let's talk rankings. So, haven't made too many changes up the top end. We know where the value is and we know where the quality is. Marvin Harrison Jr. is elite. He should be the first player taken in all rookie drafts, except in Superflex, where there's a very reasonable argument to take Caleb Williams instead. There, it really matters on what you need. But Harrison is so good that I could reasonably see him being taken first overall in Superflex drafts as well. It's pretty close between him and Williams. I think both are going to be very successful NFL players. It's just a case of what your fantasy team needs. Regardless, you should want those early picks. You should not be trading them away. We're talking about guys who, in my overall dynasty rankings, are top 5 options at their position. These are very good players. I'm very confident in their success. We saw how likely they are to succeed in the percentages earlier. These are guys you want on your fantasy rosters. The same thing with Malik Nabers. He's not a long way behind Harrison for me. I just prefer the quarterback. I prefer the quarterback situation, and I prefer the fact that he's got a little bit more talent around him, so they're going to score a little bit more. Nabers is going to get more touches, but I feel like that offense is going to struggle so much in general that those touches are not going to have as much value. I think long term, he's still going to be an excellent option. You want either of these guys on your fantasy team. In a situation where it's not a super flex league, it should go Harrison and then Nabers every single time. There is no situation where you should be going differently unless you have elite wide receivers and no quarterbacks at all, in which case I think you could reasonably go for Caleb Williams. Otherwise, you've got to take one of these top 2 wide receivers. Either that or you sell out and take an absolute bundle because these guys are worth a lot. These guys are going to be good for the next 10 years and you want them on your fantasy teams. Rome Odunze is where the value really lies. I've taken him in quite a lot of leagues around the 5th, 6th, 7th spot because he is falling, because people see him go to Chicago. They go, oh, there's a lot of talent here. That's a little bit of a concern. Keenan Allen's not going to be around for very long. DJ Moore has been solid, but I'm not convinced that he's going to be definitely the number 1 option. It wouldn't surprise me if Rome Odunze goes in and within a season or 2, he's become the number 1 option in Chicago. I think this Bears side could be very good for the next 4 or 5 years. I feel like they're very much in playoff contention. I think Caleb Williams is going to lead them well. They've got so much talent around him. I think Odunze could provide good value. And even in the meantime, I'd still expect for the next season or 2, we see him finishing as around a top 30 wide receiver and then pushing forward from there. That's better than you'd be expecting from most of these lower down guys on a reliabilities perspective. There will be players ranked below Odunze that will finish above him, but the chances of actually picking the right one correctly is very low. So for that reason, I prefer to take Odunze, know what I'm going to get in him, and know that in a couple of seasons he's going to be very good. If you're in a situation where you absolutely have to win immediately, he's probably not the best option. You can probably do a little bit better with the 2 guys below him. But in any situation other than that, where you don't desperately need a starter right now to win, I'd be taking the guys below him. And realistically, if you're in that situation, you probably want to be moving heaven and earth to try to get one of those top 2 guys. Keon Coleman sits 4th for me, and I'm very much against consensus here. I love the situation he's going into. There's not a lot of pass-catching talent there in Buffalo, but we know that Josh Allen is a very good quarterback. So he's going to have to throw the ball to somebody. Is it going to be Curtis Samuel? Is it going to be Khalil Shakir? I don't think so. Dalton Kincaid's going to be good, but he needs a star number 1 receiver, and Keon Coleman profiles as that. Now, he does have a higher bust percentage than a lot of the other guys in this range. I think there is a reasonable chance that he just plain doesn't work out at all. But I also think he has a better chance of being a true superstar and being a real number 1 receiver. He could truly take over from what Stephon Diggs was doing and have a similar level of success that Diggs had in his big seasons. So I like the upside there a lot more, and that's why I'm taking him 4th. I do recognize that there's a lot of risk when guys like Brian Thomas, the numbers say should be better, but I like Coleman's situation so much more. Same thing with Xavier Worthy. It's all a little bit messy in Kansas City. I know that Hollywood Brown's a good player, but he hasn't really panned out. I also know that Rashee Rice looks solid, but that's because they had absolutely no one else. Rashee Rice looks going to look fantastic when you compare him to Marquez Valdez-Scantling, Sky Moore, guys that realistically wouldn't even be on the field for most teams. So by comparison, Rashee Rice looks great. Now he gets some actual talent around him. I don't know that he's going to be able to compete with Xavier Worthy. I think Worthy has a good chance of being the clear number one receiver there. He has that Tyreek Hill mold, but he's not as small, and I think he can be used in a few more ways. He's extremely fast, as we know, but he's also a good route runner. He's a good catcher of the ball. He has enough talent to make things happen. That's why he's number 5 for me, and you could reasonably take him ahead of Coleman. I don't think it'd be crazy at all to take him ahead of Coleman. I think he's more likely to work out. I just think his ceiling is slightly lower. Brian Thomas Jr. is a player I like, but there's a lot of risk there, and I'm not sure that the upside really works. I think there's a good chance he ends up having some top 24 fantasy seasons, but I find it hard to see the path to him being a true superstar. He does have a lot of talent, but he has so many catch issues, and that really scares me. Players with historical catch issues can tend to struggle in the NFL, as opposed to guys who just have a bad training camp or just had one bad season. This has been an issue for a while. Plus, he can be a little bit lazy out on the field with his route running. He's a very talented player, but we haven't actually seen him put the hard work and have the success yet. So the numbers say, look, there's a good chance he's going to work out well, and that's why I've got him this high. I wouldn't have him this high if he wasn't drafted ahead of these other players. He is truly the 4th receiver taken. I don't love the situation he's going in Jacksonville. I think he's probably behind Christian Kirk, and I think there are some real bust possibilities here, and we know it can happen in that range. Ladd McConkey goes a lot higher for a lot of people. I'm not quite convinced. I don't love the chances of this offense being pass heavy enough to make it work. To be fair, he doesn't really have a lot of receiving talent competition around him. I don't think that Josh Palmer is a true number 1. I don't think DJ Chark or Quinton Johnston is going to offer anything more than a wide receiver 3, and they're probably going to play about half the time each, depending on whether they want the big-bodied guy or the deep threat. So McConkey is probably the back you want here if you're going to take somebody in the Chargers team, but I don't particularly want anybody. We know that Justin Herbert's a good player, but this is going to be a run-heavy game. We know it's going to look pretty similar to what Baltimore's done a couple of years ago. We know that Jim Harbaugh likes to do that kind of run-heavy game. He's brought in Baltimore guys to kind of run the offense. I think this is going to be pretty run-heavy. I'm not particularly interested in McConkey because the talent is not elite. He's kind of just in the same group as those other guys, and I just don't love the situation. I know a lot of people are going to say the opportunities are there. Well, guess who else had the opportunities? Keon Coleman, and he goes into an actual proper good pass-heavy offense. Xavier Legette comes next to me, and I so desperately want him to go higher, but he's going to Carolina. I just can't trust players going to Carolina as pass catchers. It's not about Bryce Young. It's more about the team in general and how it's run. The team wanted to get CJ Stroud. The coaches wanted to get CJ Stroud, and Tepper, the owner, comes in and goes, no, we're going to get Bryce Young. That's just how this team works. They're not run by the coaches properly. There's not cohesion between the coaches and the owner and the GM. It just doesn't work properly. And I think that's going to continue to be the case while Tepper is there. For that reason, even though I love Legette's talent, I think there's a good chance that he busts. He also has some separation issues, which may be an issue in the NFL. He plays a lot bigger than he actually is. He looks like he's 6'3", but he's really only 6'1". He just plays very strong, and he's very good at contested catches. He's also good after the catch, and he can get deep. He's got solid speed. I like a lot about him. I'm just worried about that situation. That's why he's a bit lower for me. Plus, he goes in that same category, same area as a lot of these other guys. I also realized that he did go 132, not 233. I projected him 233 in my mock draft, and I just put him in there without thinking. Adonai Mitchell comes next. I've actually moved him up a little bit because for me, he has more upside. I know he goes in that range where bust is more likely, but we know why he was drafted there. He wasn't drafted there as a bit of a reach because there weren't other options. He was drafted there because he fell because there were too many other options and he had more risk. But he's also got more upside. And a lot of the players below him don't have that same upside. So he moves up for me. He's my new number 9 pick. I had Polk there previously, but I found when I went into actual rookie drafts and I thought about who I wanted, most of the time when I was picking in this range, it was around the second round. My team was already pretty solid. I thought, what do I need here? Do I want a guy who I'm just going to need to be able to stick in because he's going to be my wide receiver or 3 or flex, or he's going to be a bye week option? No, most of the time I wanted a guy who can actually help me win the league because my team was ready to challenge. In that case, I want a guy with upside. And so that's why I put Mitchell a little bit higher. If you're doing a rebuild, I think Polk makes a little bit more sense. I think he has a little bit more talent. I think he's more likely to be a success in the NFL, but Mitchell has that top upside, which is why I've got him higher. Polk does go in that range of that pick, what was it, 25 to 40 range, where there is a good chance of him succeeding, but the situation in New England is really ugly. Do you want New England wide receivers? It's rarely worked out in the past when they've drafted players in this range, like N'Keal Harry, it hasn't turned out. When they've gotten free agents in, guys like Kendrick Bourne have been paid way too much money despite actually succeeding. Devontae Parker was overpaid by them. Wide receivers in New England, they don't seem to do a very good job of developing them. They don't seem to do a very good job of giving them contracts. They can't seem to make it work at all. They haven't had the quarterback talent, and I do think that Drake May coming in is going to make a big difference, but we're talking a couple of seasons down the track. So take Polk if you're doing a rebuild and you want a safer option. Mitchell goes ahead if you're looking for someone with upside. Ricky Pearsall is very low, I recognize, compared to where he was drafted. I know he's a first-round pick, but so are all these other guys in this range. They're all picked in that same region except for Mitchell. I already talked about Mitchell's upside. Pearsall, I think, is being hamstrung by the fact that they've still got Deebo Samuel and Brandon Ayuk, and they don't really look like moving them. And I know a lot of people talked about them being traded, but I think that was just smoke. I really do think that Pearsall is going to be that wide receiver 3, and that's really ugly for them, at least for this coming season, because they want Juwan Jennings out there to be a blocking wide receiver. Pearsall's not a blocking wide receiver. Neither is Deebo, neither is Brandon Ayuk. So I think Pearsall's probably only going to play about 60% of the snaps. He's not going to be out there on early downs. There are going to be situations where they move Deebo around and get him into the backfield, and in that case, they can have Pearsall out there as their second wide receiver, kind of like they did with their really low down guys like Danny Gray and people like that last season. But that's not a particularly productive fantasy position. So I think that Pearsall is a little bit capped by that. He has upside by being a relatively talented receiver, and he is a first-round receiver, and those guys do tend to hit. But if someone's going to bust, and about 30-something% of these players in that range are going to bust, I think Pearsall's the most likely. He and Leggett probably, I think, are the most likely to not work out at all. And for that reason, I've moved him a little bit lower. Rowan Wilson is my favorite of this next group of players, and there is a big gap for me between 11 and 12, and there has been the whole time. There's just such a clear gap, both in how the percentages work out, and I was really affirmed by what the numbers showed me, but also in the talent between these players here. While I talked about Pearsall and potentially struggling, he's still a really talented player. Rowan Wilson isn't close to him. Wilson did look good for Michigan at times, and it's very hard to be a good player in that offense as a pass catcher. And I think that might have caused him to fall a little bit as well. But he goes into a good situation in Pittsburgh. We know how good they are at producing talented rookie wide receivers and guys coming through on day 2. They've done it with a lot of players: Antonio Brown, Juju Smith-Schuster. Seen it more recently with George Pickens. Guys who were taken in the later rounds relative to the top wide receivers and still became successes in the NFL. They're very good at doing it, and they do it consistently. Deontay Johnson's another one. So I do think that Rowan Wilson has a good chance of succeeding because of his situation, but we know round 3 guys, there's suddenly a lot more risk with those guys. So that's why he is so much lower than Pearsall, but he's still the clear number 12 for me. Jermaine Burton, I think, also has a good chance of succeeding and being very good, but I think he has an even better chance of totally flaming out. It wouldn't surprise me at all if he barely plays in the NFL at all. There's some major character issues here. He could be off the team in a year or 2. Having said that, he could also be the true number 3 wide receiver they've needed and talented enough to push T. Higgins out the door rather than giving him another contract. I think that's possible. And I think that's probably what Cincy is thinking. Cincinnati has never been scared of taking on players with character issues, and sometimes they make it work. We know that Joe Mixon had a lot of character issues coming out of college, and yet they managed to turn him into a very good NFL player. So it could work out with Burton. He looked excellent at times when he was playing for Bama, but there's so many concerns there that there is a massive amount of risk. So you don't want to be using a valuable pick on him. And the deeper the league is, the less likely I'd be to take Burton because he's more likely to bust. If you're relying on him as being someone that you need to succeed, I don't think that's particularly likely. I think he's more likely to do nothing than he is to do something valuable. But I think if he does something valuable, he has a much higher ceiling. Malaki Corley falls below those two guys because of the upside with both of them. I think he could still be a pretty good player. I think he's still someone that's definitely worth drafting. We're talking about a guy who was taken very early in the third round, and we do know how good late second round players can be. So because he's close to that cutoff, I do think that gives him some value. He goes into an awkward situation where he's clearly behind Garrett Wilson, but there don't seem to be that many targets to go around. They run the ball a lot. They use their tight ends a surprisingly high amount, given how little we think of Tyler Conklin as a fantasy tight end. Is that because they haven't had good wide receiver options? Well, possibly in part. I mean, Alan Lazard was nominally the number 2 wide receiver, but it really turned out to be Xavier Gibson at times. Jason Brownlee was involved at times. I mean, those guys were fun to watch on Hard Knocks, but they're not good NFL players. So they needed to bring in someone who could actually be a true number 2, number 3 option. And I do think he's probably going to be that for them for a while. The question is, what happens with Rodgers and what happens with this team when he leaves? I would imagine that Aaron Rodgers has 1 or 2 seasons in him. If the team looks okay this year, I can imagine him sticking around for one more, thinking that maybe they can make it work. But if the team still looks average this year, wouldn't surprise me if Rodgers just goes, this isn't going to work. I'm out the door, and they have to hit the rebuild button. As soon as they hit that rebuild button, you're not going to want any of the Jets wide receivers because we saw how poor they looked last season. Even Garrett Wilson couldn't make it work. Corley's not going to be able to make it work either. So there's plenty of risk here with Corley. You know they're going to hit a rebuild at some point, and you know when that happens, he's going to struggle in particular. But he's the kind of guy who could hoover up those underneath targets, so maybe he still proves to be a little bit productive even when that happens. There's still a pretty big gap from him to Jalen McMillan for me. McMillan's a solid player. The talent's okay, but he goes into Tampa where he's the number 3 wide receiver, and that's never been particularly productive. As much as we talked about Trey Palmer last year, as much as we talked about Russell Gage when he went there, realistically, you don't particularly want to be the number 3 wide receiver in Tampa. They really used Cade Otton in conjunction with that number 3 just to get a couple more targets out there, but it's mainly Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, and the running backs, and that's how that offense runs, and that's fine. It works for them. They made the playoffs. They don't need to change that. They're trying to bring in a viable number 3 option because none of the guys they have at the moment have shown to be particularly good. I think it could work out okay with McMillan, but the upside's a little bit capped. Having said that, the best case scenario is he hangs around for a season or 2, Mike Evans moves on, and then he's the number 2 or the number 1. And in that case, that could work out well. I think that's probably not going to happen. I think they probably draft someone higher to replace an Evans or a Godwin, or they just bring someone new in as a free agent. But if McMillan can really prove himself, there is the opportunity to bunker down and be a good, solid player for them for the long term. Troy Franklin's number 16 for me, and a lot of people like him. I don't particularly. I find it really hard to even put him ahead of Luke McCaffrey. The reason I do is firstly because he went to college with Bo Nix. Secondly, I really enjoyed watching him in college. I think he was a fun player to watch. But I don't really know if that's going to translate to the NFL. I have a lot of concerns about him. Look, he's versatile. He's got solid speed, but he's a little bit skinny. I feel like he's going to end up a bit lower down the depth chart. I think he's going to be a bit injury prone. I just don't really see how he fits into this offense. We saw it didn't really work out with Mims. I don't really see what Franklin does better than Mims to really make it work. I feel like Mims is the guy I'd rather invest in if I were them. So I don't really understand how he's going to fit into everything. They still have Tim Patrick coming back. If he's healthy, he's actually quite a good player, and he's someone that works well in this system. Whether Sean Payton sees it that way or not, I don't know. But it's hard to know what they're doing there. They've got a lot of wide receiver talent. I don't understand how Franklin fits into it. And realistically, think about how we're valuing Courtland Sutton and then recognize that we don't even know if Troy Franklin has a role. That's got to tell you something about how to rank Franklin. He's not going to be the number 1 receiver here. And even if he was, how much do you want the Broncos' number 1 receiver? Because nobody's wanting Courtland Sutton. So I don't know why you would particularly want Troy Franklin. Luke McCaffrey's only lower for me because I really just don't see the talent. I don't understand why he went here. I much would have preferred to see Franklin go a little bit earlier or see Walker go a little bit earlier. He realistically is nearly a fourth round pick. Obviously, this was a compensatory pick at the end of the third round. So I don't really see it working. I'm not really sure how that's going to work out. He's the number 3 receiver in Washington, and we have seen that have a little bit of value in Curtis Samuel, but he's not Curtis Samuel. He doesn't have the talent. I do feel like this is going to be an awkward situation where you might even not even see the field as consistently as we hope. But there's a little bit of upside there, where there's at least a situation where you could see him taking over from Jahan Dotson, who's a real risk of being a bust at this stage. I still would favour Dotson's chances of working it out rather than McCaffrey's chances of taking over. But there is at least some upside there. There's the potential for that to work. So I can understand why people would want to draft him. I just wouldn't be going out of my way to get him. Having said that, he's really the last player on this list I'm particularly interested in. Most of these other guys I'd probably just pass on unless there were no other options at other positions either. Devontae Walker is the next of the pretty mediocre bunch. He goes into at least a solid situation. They don't really have a clear number 2. Rashad Bateman's turned into a bust. Nelson Aguilar is Nelson Aguilar. So Walker kind of goes in and takes over from that Odell Beckham situation, but you don't particularly want to be the number 2, 3, or 4 wide receiver in Baltimore. We haven't really seen it work for anybody. At least they've got Zay Flowers as their top guy, but it's mostly Flowers, Mark Andrews. We'll see a little bit of Likely probably, and a whole lot of running and a whole lot of Lamar Jackson running. That's just how this offense works. So while Jackson's the quarterback, it's going to continue to work that way. His arm talent just isn't good enough to sustain extra pass catches. Walker will probably have a couple of boom weeks at some point in time, and then he'll be brought off the waiver wire by a lot of people in redraft. But I can't imagine a situation where I'm going to feel good about starting him in the future. Javon Baker comes in at number 19, and look, he's a fantasy darling for a lot of people who love projecting low round guys. I don't really see what people are seeing. People aren't particularly loving the actual number 1 New England wide receiver in Jalen Polk, who's significantly more talented and going into a clear number 1 role. I don't understand why you'd want Baker. I'm not sure what people are seeing in this situation that makes them think, yeah, this is a guy that I really like. He's not particularly explosive, although he does have good long speed. He's got okay yak ability. He's pretty weak. He's not particularly forceful. He doesn't do anything particularly well other than being a super deep threat. That works okay with Drake May's arm, but realistically, it's not going to get you the sort of touches to make you fantasy useful. If anything, I think he's just going to be difficult for the other New England wide receivers around him and going to take away touches from them and snaps from them. I just don't see how it could possibly work for fantasy. I think his upside is to be an occasional deep threat. I can't see a situation where he's going to be an every down back. So don't go out of your way to get him. Bub Means is number 20 on my list. I don't really feel particularly good about this. There's not any other good player I particularly like. I had Malik Washington ahead of him at one stage, but I mean, realistically, he went in the 6th round, and we've seen the success rate of 6th round wide receivers. And so these numbers actually caused me to make a few changes here. I moved Bub Means up because I do like the situation he's going into. He's only competing against, well, not Chris Olave, obviously, he's the number 1 receiver, but he's competing against Rashid Shaheed, who's an undrafted free agent. And in fact, he's probably one of the better undrafted free agents of recent years. And he's competing against A.T. Perry, who's a 6th round guy. Neither of them have really showed anything in particular. I think there's a real path for Means to be a top 2 or 3 receiver in this offense. Now, I don't particularly want to be a top 2 or 3 receiver in this offense, but it's better than nothing. And it's certainly better than a lot of the other guys taken in this range who are realistically mostly special teamers. I do think Means has at least a path to being fantasy relevant. He's got good speed. I'm a little bit worried about separation issues with him, but he's got a solid side. He's at least a player that you can imagine being an every down receiver in the NFL. I think it probably doesn't happen, but there's at least the potential for him to hit, and that's why I've got him ranked this high. Now, if you want to see more about wide receiver stuff, well, go over to my website at ffdfantasyfootball.com, where I've talked a whole heap about Dynasty. I've got my Dynasty rankings up there. I've got my rookie rankings up there. I've even got redraft as well. There's plenty of articles on every single position. Plus, I'll be back in the next couple of days to talk about tight end hit rates. Then after that, I'll be going across and we'll be talking more fantasy rankings. If you've got any questions, make sure you hit me up in the comments, or you can DM me on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down. Of course, I'm also on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O, and you can check out our website as well. Make sure you like and subscribe. I will catch you next time.